super excited for that. So I think we'll get started.
Right.
And those of you who haven't signed in, just so you know, we're recording. Feel like it's some kind of Zoom gesture to tell you that. So it's my great pleasure to welcome all of you. I'm Matt Basso. I'm telling you that because some of you will just see this in a recording. This is our first, Kathleen Cahill, Dr. Kathleen Cahill is our first speaker in the Aileen Clyde book talk series. I'm very excited for this. Kathleen probably doesn't even know, but Susan Johnson will follow after you, and then Jennifer Holland. So a fantastic set of speakers. I'm super excited for it. This series is sponsored by the Aileen H. Clyde Women's History Initiative here at the University of Utah, which is a relatively new initiative that has a couple of different objectives. It is broadly trying to build an archive, trying to create an archive that really helps scholars and others have fantastic access to primary sources about 20th century women's lives. The cornerstone of the archive are oral histories, but we're also bringing a bunch of manuscript collections underneath the umbrella of the Clyde Archive. And I'm super thankful to the Clyde family and to the foundation for supporting this and supporting the Clyde professorship in the university, as well as supporting all sorts of different student initiatives. You can find out more information about the Clyde archive, the initiative, and the remarkable Aileen Clyde, Aileen Clyde herself on our history department website. And I've put the address there, but if you just Google University of Utah History Department, you'll find the information for the Clyde resources. It's a growing archive. We're still adding more oral histories to it. We're still adding more manuscript collections, but the idea is for folks to be able to launch remarkable projects like the one that Kathleen Cahill launched. So we're super excited to hear about Recasting the Vote. I took a couple of quick minutes and looked in the archive for suffrage materials, and it was pretty exciting, really. There wasn't any that were within the oral history collection directly on suffrage, of course, but there was a bunch of links that our interviewees in the 80s and 90s and 2000s saw between suffrage, of course, and ERA, which is maybe something that folks will want to ask about later. We'll see. But without further ado, and again, with thanks to the Clyde Foundation, and especially thanks to our speaker, I want to shift gears and introduce Kathleen Cahill. So Dr. Cahill is, of course, the author of Recasting the Vote. She has a forthcoming project on Indians on the Road, Gender, Race, and Regional Identity. Her previous book, another remarkable work, came out of University of North Carolina Press, just like this one. This book you're going to learn a lot about, but all of her work really takes gender and race as central questions, and of course, U.S. Western history. She serves for a long time as the steering committee chair for the Coalition for Western Women's History, a very long time, and that's incredibly appreciated by those of us who are lucky enough to work with her in some capacity in that work. And her books have been award-winning ventures. So without further ado, Kathleen, thank you for joining us, and we're excited to hear about this remarkable work.
Thank you so much, Matt. I could say the same about you being a delightful person to work with for the coalition. And actually, I'm thrilled to hear about this new project, this new collection and archive. And when we do the call for news for the newsletter, I think you should definitely let folks know about it, because I think they'll be really interested. Yeah.
Yeah, great idea.
And so it's really exciting. I am going to also try to share my screen here. and it's gonna knock you off apparently, which is,
Yeah, that's good.
there you go, get out. And I'm going to set a timer because I could talk for a very long time about this, but I'm gonna keep it to the 30 minutes. So thank you for inviting me here. I'm in amazing company with the folks coming up. And as you said, I'm drawing this talk tonight, kind of giving you an overview of my book, Recasting the Vote, which I describe as a collective biography of 6 suffragists of color. And here they are. I'll give a very brief introduction to each of them here, and then I'm going to go through their stories a little bit more specifically and talk about them in the talk. So the upper left, the woman getting into the car, is a New Mexican Hispana, is how she would have identified herself. We might say Latina, named Nina Otero Warren. Going across clockwise is Marie Louise Bottineau Baldwin, who was a member of the Turtle Mountain Chippewa Nation, and she's also of French descent. To her right is a Chinese American woman named Mabel Lee. And then Laura Cornelius Kellogg is a Wisconsin Oneida woman who was an author and advocate. Next to her is Carrie Williams Clifford, another author. Many of these women were authors. Clifford was a poet and activist. And then next to her is Mrs. Gertrude Bonin, or also known as Jake Hollisaw, whom you probably know about here in Utah. And I'm going to talk about her a little bit more specifically in her work here. So what I was trying to do in the book, and I hope to do today, is demonstrate that women of color from many different communities were involved in the fight for suffrage before 1920, and as we'll see, after 1920. And these are the women my book focuses on. And as I said, Gertrude Bonin is in Utah for a while. But what I've tried to do in this talk is also kind of throw in a few connections to Utah. And I see that we have someone from Better Days 2020 here, and the work you guys did with your curriculum has been really wonderful, and I drew on some of it. So before I show the rest of the slides, I just want to give a little warning that these are historical images, and some of the language and images on these slides are stereotypes, or in some cases quite racist. And I'm going to put that into context, but I just want to let people know that before I move on. Also, I use the word, or the phrase, women of color in the title. And what I hope to do while using that is to show that these women do have some things in common, particularly their experiences in engaging with white women, but they also have very different experiences on the basis of race, ethnicity, citizenship status. And so women of color was an umbrella term that by the end of the book, I hope people can see is not really, is less encompassing, right? That these women have many different experiences. So I'm gonna suggest how mainstream white suffragists, kind of the people whose stories we usually know, were thinking about women of color and their connection to suffrage and the vote. But then I'm going to suggest why these women, and particularly these 6 women and the women in their communities, why they were motivated to join the suffrage movement, right? Why they saw suffrage as a powerful tool for their lives and for their communities. So, sorry about that. Okay, so my book really focuses on that period in the kind of early 20th century, when many of the suffrage groups returned to a focus on a national amendment rather than the state-by-state strategy. You here in Utah, of course, know that the fight for suffrage had been going on much longer than that. And in terms of thinking about African-American women, right, they had been involved with the fight for civil rights and suffrage rights from the beginning, right? In the US, the women's rights movement really grows out of the abolitionist movement of the 1830s. But even before that, Black women were advocating for their rights. We can look at Phyllis Wheatley Peters of the Revolutionary period and see her advocating for rights after the Revolution. So despite this connection between abolition and women's rights, after the Civil War, many white suffragists rejected Black women. And in fact, the movement splits over the question of race, and especially whether or not women's suffrage groups should support the 15th Amendment, which enfranchised Black men, but not women. White women's efforts to keep Black women less visible in the suffrage movement was also part of their strategy as Jim Crow begins to take over the American South. White suffragists are trying to woo Southern politicians who are openly racist. And they're talking about how enfranchising women will increase the African-American vote in the South. So white suffragists are trying to say, trying to keep Black suffragists sort of hidden and really emphasize white women's votes. So as a result, much of Black women's suffrage work took place in their own communities, and particularly in the National Association of Colored Women, which was founded in 1896. It's sort of a national umbrella group for Black women's organizations, and it becomes a really important site for suffrage activism. And you can see Carrie Williams Clifford's name in here in the officer list. So it focuses on suffrage, but for Black women, the vote was really a tool to address many of the other issues that they faced. And like many women in the United States, some of those questions were about things like childhood education or maternal and infant health. But many of these issues were pretty specific to their community, right? The violence of lynching, Jim Crow laws, and the disenfranchisement of Black men throughout the South. And indeed, for all of the women that I discuss in the book, the question of voting rights really meant voting rights for women, but also for men. I just want to point out that Black women in the West also developed women's clubs, and the Western Federation of Colored Women's Clubs met in Utah in 1904. And the president of that federation, Mrs. Elizabeth Taylor, was from Salt Lake City. And you can read more about her in the Better Days 2020 website. And right, as a woman in Utah, it seems like she was likely able to vote at this time before 1920. We know for sure she was involved in the Colored Women's Republican Club. Carrie Williams Clifford, whom I focus on, was also involved in Colored Women's Clubs. She was the founder and first president of the Ohio Federation. And again, their sort of activism and concerns differed from many white suffragists because they face the prejudice of Jim Crow. And you can see here in her first book of poetry in the table of contents that Clifford's addressing a lot of these things, both in her activism as a club woman, but also in her poetry. So for example, the poem Reply to Thomas Dixon was a rejection of the novel that eventually becomes the infamous film, A Birth of a Nation. And she actually writes a poem about the film in her next set of poetry. And she also wrote about Atlanta's Shame is a poem about the 1906 urban massacre in Atlanta, where white Atlantans attack Black neighborhoods. But she also celebrates Black women's history. So To My Mother and The Colored Graduate are really, again, these kind of celebrations of Black women. So despite white women's attempts to sideline them, Black women insisted on participating in some of the most famous suffrage actions of the period. Clifford marches in the first National Suffrage Parade in Washington, D.C. in 1913. That first slide of the call for the amendment is from that parade. And there were a number of African-American women there, including Ida B. Wells Barnett and Mary Church Terrell, as well as members of Howard University's newly founded Delta Sigma Theta sorority. And as you may have heard, this parade gets talked about a lot. White organizers were pretty hesitant to include Black women. Then they tried to make them march at the end of the parade. But Black women really refuse that, and they insist on marching where they want to march. So in the professional sections, in the college section, and then with different states. And Clifford takes part in this, and we in fact know a lot about where women marched because she wrote a report about it for the crisis and named each woman and where they marched. So I'm gonna shift over to Native women here. And in that 1913 parade, Black women weren't the only women of color to participate. But other groups had really different receptions from the organizers who had asked Black women to kind of not participate. So, and that's partially because of the way that white suffragists were thinking about these different groups of women. For Native women, they tend to romanticize them. And they think about Native women as people who had political power in their traditional societies, but white Americans believed that those societies and cultures were really vanishing. And in fact, the federal government's sort of policy at this time is to destroy tribal sovereignty and indigenous cultures through property laws, the Dawes Act, dividing up reservation land, through the boarding schools, and through a variety of laws that outlaw cultural traditions. And these are really brutal policies that led to a great deal of trauma in Native communities who, as a result of those policies, were facing poverty and starvation, disease, and destruction of family and polity. The government also denies US citizenship to Native people. So instead, they were conceived of as legally wards of the government. So like children or the mentally ill, they're unable to make any decisions for themselves and therefore ineligible to vote. And you can see here that the women of the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois Confederacy were sort of the ones really held up as part of these matriarchal traditions. And they have a little box here on this slide, I don't know if you can read it, that lists the many rights that Iroquois or Haudenosaunee women had that white women were trying to get, right? But there's a sense of kind of, they're passing the baton to these white suffragists marching by them. But white suffragists learned a lot of these ideas from Indigenous women themselves, right? So here you see some headlines of Native women who were asked to speak at suffrage groups and clubs, and women like Marie Bottineau Baldwin and Laura Cornelius Kellogg, who as a Wisconsin Oneida woman is connected to the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and Gertrude Bonin, take advantage of this platform, the fact that they're asked to talk, and they use it to educate white women on the difficulties that face Native women in the present. Gertrude Bonin in particular constantly emphasizes the Indians of today. And they all point out, right, that they're legal wards who couldn't address these issues politically because they had no political power. And I need to say, right, of course, that not all Native women wanted US citizenship. Many asserted, right, they already had sort of membership in their own nations. But for these national activists that I look at, they were advocating for US citizenship. They saw it as a really useful tool, but they were also insisting that the US honor its treaty promises and honor sovereignty. So they're really making an argument that's much more like a dual citizenship. And they believed that with the right to vote, they could influence some of these harmful federal policies. Right? I'm going to come back to Gertrude Bonin in a little bit towards the end. So I'm going to shift over to the Chinese women here for a second. White suffragists sometimes also invited Chinese women to participate in their meetings. There is a Chinese woman named Mrs. Wu in that 1913 parade on a float. And they particularly do this after the 1911 Chinese Revolution. So this is not the Communist Revolution of 1949. This was a Republican revolution that overthrew the Qing dynasty. And revolutionary leaders like Sun Yat-sen supported women's rights. And as news is sort of filtering over to the United States, Americans believed that the Chinese had enfranchised women after this revolution. It's quite a bit more complicated. I'm happy to talk about it. But in the different provinces, there were different sort of policies. And in Canton, or Guangdong province, where most of the Chinese immigrants in the United States had come from, they had in fact enfranchised women. And you can see from the cartoon that American suffragists were very interested in these events and were using them to kind of encourage, there's this sort of global sisterhood on one hand, but it's also, as I'll talk about, a way of sort of shaming American men. You can also see here that they're not always clear on their Asian cultures because these so-called Chinese women are wearing Japanese kimonos, Japanese sort of traditional shoes and hairstyles. So, their kind of understanding of the differences among Asian people is blurred. So a little bit of bigger context here. In the United States, China is seen as a very backwards country, kind of the opposite of the Western world, right? They draw these distinctions between the Occident and the Orient. It's so foreign, in fact, that Congress has passed a series of laws known as the Chinese Exclusion Act starting in 1882 that ban the vast majority of Chinese people from being able to immigrate to the United States, and those that can immigrate are banned from being able to naturalize as citizens, so they cannot become citizens. This is the only group of people that the US does this for before 1924, 1917, 1924, right? So for white suffragists, it's embarrassing that this supposedly backwards country, right, who's so different from the United States, has enfranchised women before the US has. So there are a number of Chinese women in the US, mostly in California and Hawaii, but like Native women, they are participating in suffrage movements for a couple of different reasons. One, they're very proud of China and their country and the revolution, but also because, again, they see it as an opportunity to speak to some of the most politically active white women, right, and to really have a stage and an audience. And they certainly are happy to talk about China, right, because it overturns some of the stereotypes about that country. But they also make a plea for help for the Chinese immigrants in the United States. So the issues their communities face, like the prejudice, the really harsh immigration restrictions, and other issues. So in the actual photograph picture, what you see is one of these suffrage meetings. The woman standing at the podium is the Reverend Dr. Anna Howard Shaw, who at the time was president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, the main organization. And this was in New York City. And you can see that 3 Chinese women are on the stage with her, along with 2 children. On the left, on my left anyway, is a woman named Pearl Lu Lin. On the far right, seated, is Lai Bek Lee, and her daughter Mabel Lee is standing right behind her, and Mabel is whom I focus on. At this meeting, they tell the women about what happened in China, but then they really focus their talks on calls to help their community in New York. So they call for better schools and better parks for the Chinese American children in New York City. Mabel Lee is a really fascinating figure. She's a high school student at this meeting, and she is apparently incredibly charismatic. She is about to enter Barnard College, and when she does, she is a very active suffragist. And she's speaking to 2 different audiences. She's speaking to the white American suffragists, many of whom come through Barnard, right? New York City is a big hub for suffrage activism. But she's also speaking to the leaders of the new Chinese nation and encouraging them to incorporate women's rights into the new government. So she's a real transnational activism. And I say she's speaking to government leaders, but she's primarily speaking to the Chinese students who are on exchange programs. There was a major exchange program for college students. It's mostly men, and they are being trained basically to be the politicians and engineers, the leaders of the new nation. So she is very involved in their organizations, the Chinese Student Association. And I just want to point out that this kind of transnational activism is not limited to, say, New York City and a couple of women. You see this throughout Chinatowns in the United States, including in Salt Lake City. So this is an article from right after, right in the sort of wake of the revolution. There are parades and celebrations in Salt Lake City celebrating the new government, and women were in this parade. And it's striking because one of the stereotypes Americans had about Chinese women is that they are repressed, right? They have bound feet, they are kept in their homes, they're not allowed to be out and about. And so a lot of articles about how they are speaking when Sun Yat-sen's on speaking tours, that they're participating in these celebrations, right? We see again that they're paying attention to politics in both countries. And then I talk about Spanish-speaking women, particularly in New Mexico. And there they also become involved in suffrage in part to advocate for their communities. In New Mexico, where the majority of the population were Spanish speakers, women like Nina Otero Warren, whom you see here, advocated for bilingual education. She comes from a family of very powerful politicians. She's well connected. They live in Santa Fe. And so because of that, and she's upper class, right, they're large landowners, that status gives her access to the white women's suffrage organizations. And I really shouldn't even say white, I should just say mainstream suffrage, because in New Mexico, they're integrated with Anglos and Hispanics. When national suffrage leaders come to New Mexico to try to organize, she insists that any kind of suffrage work has to be bilingual. That if they don't appeal to Spanish-speaking politicians through the Spanish-speaking community, they're going to lose, right? And she becomes a leader in the state organization. The National Women's Party has a branch in New Mexico. She's first vice president, and then she becomes basically president of that organization. And she makes sure that the literature and many of the speeches are in Spanish and English. And you can see that in California, in the California state suffrage referendum, there was some of this, particularly in Los Angeles. But it's in New Mexico that you see kind of the most engagement with the Spanish-speaking community. In Texas, most Spanish-speaking women are kind of in the same situation as African Americans in Texas. They're poor, they're agricultural workers, they're not kind of white suffragists don't engage them, and many of them can't vote because of things like the poll tax or literacy requirements. So Spanish-speaking women, it sort of depends on where they are. They have different experiences. But in New Mexico becomes the 32nd state out of 36 to ratify the 19th Amendment, and they needed all 36 right, to ratify. And so if Spanish-speaking women hadn't been involved in the fight, it's doubtful that New Mexico would have ratified it. It actually comes down to a pretty tight vote where Nina Otero Warren is literally on the floor and in the politicians' offices kind of whipping up votes to finally get it to pass. So again, without that vote, it would have been potentially a different story. So in this quick overview, I hope I've demonstrated that women of color face some similarities, particularly the kind of stereotypes and prejudices that white Americans kind of imposed on them, but their motivations to fight for suffrage really comes from different places. And their experiences after 1920 also vary dramatically. And so I want to talk about that a little bit before closing out. This is different in every state, right? And we know that it's state laws that really regulate voting. And New Mexico is actually a really good example of these differences, right? And I'm going to show some headlines, again, with some problematic language. But here are 3 headlines from sort of the immediate 1920s. And you can see just from what they're saying, there's kind of these different experiences. So in 1920, the New Mexico State Constitution says you cannot limit the right to vote on the basis of race, color, or language. So Anglos, Hispanics, and the few African-American women in the state are able to vote in 1920. Now they cannot hold office. They have to amend the Constitution in New Mexico to allow women to hold anything that beyond kind of educational offices. And they do that in 1921. And Nina Otero Warren ends up in 1922 getting the Republican nomination for Congress. So she runs for Congress. I'm sorry, this is going to ring for a minute. I apologize. She's one of the first women to run for Congress after 1920, and she's definitely the first woman of color. But in that same election where they amend the Constitution to allow women to run for office, they also amend it to say that Asians cannot own land in New Mexico, right? So the numbers were already really small, but that's a disincentive to move to the state, right, for Asian immigrants. And after 1924, as I mentioned, sort of the Chinese Exclusion Acts are applied to all Asians. And that really doesn't change until the 1960s and the 1965 Immigration Act. So this sense of, Asian populations are just too foreign to be part of the US. And as you know, Jim Crow laws were applied across the South to Black men. And then after 1920, they are applied to Black women as well. And as I mentioned, in places like Texas, many of those keep Mexican Americans from voting too. In New Mexico, Black women are able to vote, and they do, as you can see here, but there are other ways in which they get disenfranchised. So for example, a project I'm actually following up on and can talk about, there's a large number of women who are the wives of African-American soldiers in southern New Mexico who try to vote in 1920, but are kept from voting because they are not residents of the state, right? But I'm pretty sure that their votes are kind of flagged because they're Black women and it's assumed they'll vote Republican. So, and then as you see on the bottom line, many Native people remain wards of the government in 1920, and so they are unable to vote. And here's where we come back to Gertrude Bonnen. She plays a really important role after 1920 in my book, but also just generally. She'd been active politically for a long time. She had moved to Washington, D.C. in 1917 to become the secretary of the Society of American Indians, which was a group that's very similar to the NAACP, advocating for sort of civil rights and sovereignty rights for Native people. You can see here in this pamphlet, which she has the American flag sort of strategically around a picture of her in, sort of traditional clothing. And this was a speech she was giving around this time in the 20s, where she was advocating to Americanize the first Americans. So she's advocating for US citizenship and voting rights for Native people. And I just want to show this really incredible chart that was a visual that she used. It's really big, it's like 3x2. It's at the Newberry Library, and she used this when she would give these talks. And you can see what we have is bureaucracy, right? Wards of the government. And what we want is democracy, which, as you can see from the circle, is a much richer experience, and that includes women's votes very explicitly in there, but also includes land, includes some cooperative ownership of things like farming equipment and animals, and religious freedom. So a lot of the things that she'd been critical of, she sort of offers this alternative vision. I also think it's really significant that she envisions this as within circles, right, in circular visuals, because that is very much sort of coming out of her Dakota tradition. And so she's continuing to talk to white women. And in fact, you see here in the bottom image, she goes to a big conference in February of 1921. So right after the amendment is passed, the National Women's Party kind of holds this big convention to say, like, what do we do next? It's in Washington, D.C. She goes and she says, Native women and men still can't vote. So maybe you could work on that. And in fact, Black women, Mary Church Terrell also sort of says the same thing about Southern Black women. But Alice Paul and the National Women's Party choose to focus on the ERA instead of this. Bonnen keeps pushing for this though, and a few months later, she ends up in Salt Lake City at the General Federation of Women's Clubs convention, where she says something very similar. And they actually listen to her and hire her as a speaker and send her around the country speaking on this for, I think it's the next 2 years, and advocating for citizenship for Native people. And she's really significant. This activism is really part of getting Congress to pass the 1924 Indian Citizenship Act. She builds a lot of her argument on the fact that Native men are veterans of World War I, that they performed military service for the nation, and that they deserve, therefore, kind of full citizenship rights, which is significant. And so in 1924, she then says, okay, great. And she makes this pamphlet on the right. And you can see she's laid out how many Native people live in each state. And so she's thinking of a strategy of how to influence kind of at the state level using the vote, right? A Native voting bloc. And as you can see on the next slide, she's not the only one thinking that, right? These headlines for the elections of 24, 26, and 28 show that a lot of people are wondering how kind of newly enfranchised Native people are going to change politics, particularly in certain states, right? And so what you see after this are a number of states with large Native populations looking to the American South and passing laws that look a lot like Jim Crow laws, but that are aimed at Native people, at non-English speakers like Asian and Hispanic populations. And they're using these seemingly colorblind rules like literacy tests to disenfranchise them. And they are pretty successful in getting a lot of people, kind of off the rolls. One of the other strategies is really specific to Native people, right, in a way that other people of color don't experience, is they use their relationship to the federal government against them. So New Mexico and Arizona, court cases both rule in both those states that Native people living on reservations who are, even though they're US citizens, are seen as wards of the government, right? Because they live on reservation land that's under the control of the federal government. Utah had earlier passed a state law that basically said the same thing. If you live on a reservation, you can't vote. And in all three of those states, most Native people live on reservation land, right? So that makes it very difficult. And partly this was because, right, initially Native people were voting. In Michigan, the first Native woman is elected to the Michigan State Legislature, Cora Reynolds Anderson. 2 years later, they redistrict and she loses her seat through redistricting. Charles Curtis was elected Vice President of the United States in 1928. He is Native, he's of Kaw and Potawatomi descent. People in Washington know this. He's been in Congress for years. And Gertrude Bonin, as she watches these state laws disenfranchising Native people kind of right away, is outraged and talks about how if Charles Curtis had lived on a reservation, right, he would not be able to vote, let alone become Vice President of the United States. So for all of these groups, really, it's not really for Native people who are disenfranchised in the West, for people who don't speak English, for whom those literacy laws in the West are disenfranchised, for Southern African Americans and Mexican Americans in Texas. It's really not until the 1965 Voting Rights Act and its amendments in the 1970s where women and men from those communities finally have access to the right to vote. And that was still tenuous, right? There were still struggles against that. And then, of course, as you probably know, in 2013, in the Shelby County v. Holder case, the Supreme Court really weakened a major part of that 1965 Act. So it was really only in place for 50 years. And as a result of that 2013 ruling, that's why we're seeing all of these new laws that address voting and voting rights across the nation. So that is not great, but I don't want to end on that note. So I'm just going to end with this picture, right, to suggest that 100 years after the 19th Amendment, we know that fight went on, but right, sort of the experience of firsts, right, where we get the first woman, the first woman of color, the first African American, and the first Asian American woman as Vice President of the United States. And here she is swearing in, so Kamala Harris, swearing in Deb Haaland, who was one of the first two Native women elected to Congress, and then is the first Native woman to serve as Secretary of the Interior. So we were kind of here in 2022, both hopeful, but also really in need of being vigilant about voting rights. So I will stop there and happy to answer questions from anyone.
Thank you, Kathleen. That was fantastic. It's a big book, right? I mean, it covers a lot of terrain. I'm like, oh, geez, I feel kind of lousy asking her to try to summarize in 30 minutes. And you pulled it off remarkably well. So thank you so much. I'm going to take the prerogative of asking the first question because, you know, I own my own computer here, so I can just scream over everyone. And then my students and others, no doubt, will weigh in. And I've got a ton of questions, but I'm just going to start with one. I'm curious about the class politics within sort of the suffrage movement. I have some sense of how it works among white women and the suffrage movement, though, please comment on that if you'd like. But how about women of color? Many of these women seem pretty elite, and I'm curious about their sense of voting rights for everyone, and voting rights for all women, and how they feel like class intersects with their own racialized and gendered identity.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Great question. For these women and for most of the women in their communities, yeah, it's elite, fairly well educated, and of course, the class part of it, right? The wealth part of it is relative, but in their communities, they tend to be kind of upper class. There's certainly nothing like, I mean, the main, like, many of the leaders in the white suffrage movement are incredibly wealthy, right? Alva Belmont is ridiculously wealthy, but there's a lot more, I think, of a range in the white women's suffrage movement. Working class women and industrial workers are really engaged. But from what I can tell, I would say Black women, there's probably, again, there are just more Black women involved in the suffrage movement through those women's clubs. So there's a little bit more of a range, but it's still a pretty, it's a kind of women who subscribe often to the kind of respectability and middle class standards. I mean, the whole club women movement is very much about uplift, right? Their motto, the National Association of Colored Women's motto is "lifting as we climb." So there is a little bit of a sense of paternalism there, but also, again, kind of a communal ethic. But certainly, so, someone like Mabel Lee, her family is not just elite, but they're also Christian. And a lot of the Chinese women, and not all of them are Chinese American, right? Mabel Lee was actually not a citizen of the United States. She could not, because she came over as a 5-year-old. Conversion to Christianity is clearly a big part of this, and she draws a lot of her ideas about sex equality from Christianity. She draws from a lot. She actually talks a lot about kind of where her ideas come from, and that's certainly one of them. So yeah, I think you don't see as much, you don't see as many poor women, in part because these communities, like, poor women can't, like, this is, you have to have time and energy, and they don't always have that. But it's a really good question.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm going to come back around to like a follow-up a little bit later, if others don't, because I'm super fascinated in that topic. All right, so the floor is open to my students and anyone else that would like to ask a question, or you can let me monopolize the conversation. It's up to you. So any questions from this peanut gallery? They're sitting in a room with people, so I can say that. Yeah, go ahead, Eliza. So I'm gonna repeat Eliza's question. Oh, wait a minute. Julie's just given Eliza the computer. I'm gonna do some kind of mute juggling here and see how we do. Go ahead.
Okay. Okay. So something that I really appreciated about your book is the scope that it's not just national, but international. And I wondered how you made the decision of what to include and what not to include. And if there was anything that felt really pertinent, but you just didn't have the space for it, or that you thought was really interesting, but you couldn't find room.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. So, I mean, the way the book, in terms of kind of going internationally, I never meant to do that, other than thinking about Native women, right? As colonized nations. But it was following the women themselves. So, right, particularly the Chinese women and Mabel Lee, like that story. So let me back up a little bit. the way I thought I was gonna tell this story was to take the 1913 parade and kind of talk about the different groups of women that were in it, because Marie Louise Bottineau Baldwin is in it. This woman named Mrs. Wu is in it. There's a number of African-American women in it. And then people had said that every state in the Union was represented. And I was really hoping to find like a Hispanic woman from New Mexico. I never did. But initially I thought, well, that I'll focus on that parade and kind of go out from there. But then as I was looking in the newspaper databases, I came across Mabel Lee, and she is all over. I don't remember if I said this in the talk, but the students know this. She's asked, I didn't say this is dumb. The picture of her in the first slide, she's on a horse. It's because she's, thanks Holly, thanks for coming. Because she's been asked to ride at the opening of the 1912 New York City suffrage parade. So that's the year before DC. And it's huge. It's the biggest suffrage parade that's happened in the nation. Up to this point, it's enormous, so like 5,000 women. And she's all over the newspaper coverage about this parade, right? And again, she's asked to ride in this place of honor. There are pictures of her. And I just thought, what is happening here, right? That doesn't fit any narrative of suffrage or of US history from the turn of the century that I have ever heard. Like, I don't understand this. I don't understand what's happening here. And that is always a good place to be like, so clearly something is going on, right? So I started following her and tried to figure out why they had asked her to be in that parade, why they were highlighting her, and as well as other women. The photo of the parade that the Women's Journal, so the Women's Journal is the one that had that cartoon of the Chinese women, and it's a major suffrage organ. The picture it uses for the cover for the parade coverage of 1912 is Anna Howard Shaw, so the president, holding up a banner that says Nassau catching up with China. Again, like, why did they highlight that? And so in answering that question, I had to go international, because the only way to answer that was you have to know the context. The context is the Chinese Revolution has just happened. And that seems totally, again, for white American women, that is just crazy, right? They cannot believe it. So they're kind of putting Chinese women forward is actually really, it seems like, oh, look, they're being so inclusive. But what they're actually doing is really sticking it to white American men and saying, how can you insult us like this, right? How can you let China, totally backwards nation, remember, like, enfranchise its women and look more modern than you can, right, than us. We need to catch up with China. The Chinese women in the United States take full advantage of that, right? And that's why they agree to participate, because they know they'll have a platform. But so it was really very long-winded, but it was really about following those stories and trying to understand why people were where they were. And all, these women have transnational lives. Mabel Lee absolutely has a transnational life. I had sort of thought, well, maybe I'll figure out what's going on with Mexico. And in the Mexican Revolution, there are definitely sort of stories about women who are fighting in the Mexican Revolution, and that does influence sort of ideas about Latina political activism. So the book Chicana Power by Miley Blackwell, she talks about how those women are remembered. And I have that one picture in my book where Americans are aware, white Americans are aware of this as well. And they have that picture of the woman with the bandolier. But I didn't end up following that. And then the other, and I will say that, what's her name? Catherine, I'm going to forget her name. It'll come back to me. But she wrote this amazing book called Feminism for the Americas that takes off, follows the National Women's Party, which gets really interested after 1920 in kind of connecting with feminists in Latin America. And, they're basically trying to export US suffrage, but the women in Latin America come from different genealogies of feminism and have really different ideas. It's a great book. I don't know, I can't remember her last name. But the one piece that I wrote a whole chapter on and then ultimately couldn't have in the book was I was following up, the woman in the 1913 parade, and her name was Mrs. Wu. And I was like, okay, so I'm looking for a Mrs. Wu in Washington, D.C. And it turns out that the wife of the Chinese ambassador, the minister, to the United States from like 1897 to like 1907 was this woman named Madame Wu, and she's like really famous. She's sort of the first Chinese ambassador's wife who is visible, who holds kind of the at-homes that all the ambassadors' wives have, and that she's engaged in those circles. And I really thought it was her for a long time. And I wrote this whole thing about her, and she goes back to China, and he's involved in the revolution. And she actually helps found one of the first a women's suffrage organization in Shanghai. And some of her experiences in the US clearly influenced that. It was great. It's a great chapter. But it meant that I had like 3 chapters about Chinese women at the beginning of the book, and it just wasn't going to work. It was like, it either had to be a book about Chinese women and suffrage and those transnational ties, or I had to lose that, because it was right. If I wanted it to be about this group of women, I couldn't front load it that much with Chinese women's stories. So it was easiest to kind of cut her part of the story out, which is, so very long answer, but yeah, there was a lot following the women, and yeah, kind of thinking about how to structure the narrative.
I was just told I was muted.
And I can't see your mouth, so I can't tell you.
Classic, right? Exactly. I was going to say that, I mean, even the entire sort of framework of suffrage has such transatlantic ties to it as a story, that it's really remarkable to see these other ties, right? I mean, that's just a spectacular part of the book. And it must have been so painful to cut that chapter, to have all that great material, but what are you going to do? Okay, I've got a zillion other questions, and we have to let you go not too long and let other people go, but I want to see if anybody else has a question before I dive in with others. So I want to know about I'm not giving them any more chances. I want to know about the opponents. I feel like we don't talk enough about it. Almost feels like it's hard to imagine these folks, right? And I know it's really not, but it's like, okay, so who was opposed to women's suffrage? And were the folks that were opposed to women's suffrage, what was their racial lens like, right? Were they going to oppose women's suffrage because they didn't want women of color? And so you have to oppose all suffrage, or how did they split these hairs of discrimination, basically, right? How did they decide what their discrimination story was going to be about? And what was the essence of that story? What's the anti-suffrage argument?
Oh, that's such a good question. So I will say that I don't think we have enough, certainly not enough about kind of communities of color at all, anti-suffrage. And there's actually not a ton written on anti-suffragists themselves, right? They're always the foil for these stories, but there hasn't been a ton of work on it. It's growing, I think, but yeah. So again, I'm going to say that it sort of depends, right? It depends on which community we're talking about. So there are Black men who don't support women's suffrage, and the arguments that Black women use when they're talking to them are really different, right? Their arguments when they're talking to that group are things like, this is just like racial discrimination, which you definitely don't like, so you should be supporting us. Like, how do you not see this? But of course, there's lots of support from Black men too who do see that. I mean, W.E.B. Du Bois is like a huge proponent that uses the crisis. They host a couple different suffrage symposiums. Frederick Douglass, obviously. And again, some of that does fall out, I think, on class lines, but I feel like we need a lot more. It could be interesting. I don't know. But I do think there's more of a sense, because of disenfranchisement, that the African-American community also recognizes like the importance of the vote, but there's also a lot of gendered sort of, way to prove masculinity is to be a head of household and to have kind of political authority. That makes you a man. So there's all of those different things. Again, in Native communities, right, not this I don't see necessarily along gender line as much, but right, not everybody thinks that they need the vote, right? And that continues to today. There are a lot of Native people who won't participate in it because it's sort of ceding, right, political authority. Yeah, there we go. That's right. Exactly. Thank you, Michelle. Michelle's got a great, that story is one of the craziest ones, right? That the first woman, and she's, Euro-American woman, elected to Congress is an anti-suffragist, right? So there are lots of white women who are anti-suffragists for a lot of reasons, but part of it is, again, these kind of gendered ideas about gender difference, right? And that politics is the male sphere, and if women get involved in that, they are losing their moral authority, and that's a huge issue. And then those women face this real conundrum after 1920 or whenever their state enfranchised women of, do they then use this new tool that they had been against or not, right? And Alice Roberts does decide to at least get involved in elective office. But most of the anti-suffrage activism is coming from men, white men, right? And even there it's different, but let me talk about the South. There it's all about race for them. I mean, gender's in there, right? It intersects, but it's also, Southerners hate the idea of a national amendment because it implies that the federal government has a say in voting. And they do not want that, right? Because they have effectively disenfranchised on a state-by-state basis. They're worried, so they're worried about the 19th Amendment would bring up kind of questions about the fact that the 15th Amendment is being violated and no one's doing anything about it. So the suffrage organizations then are constantly, on North and South, the white women are arguing that even though we want a national amendment, it's okay because state voter registration laws will take care of any problem, right? They're like, they're all states' rights when it comes to that. They just want the national amendment, right? So this is the conundrum for people like Alice Paul, who just want Black women not to be visible because it doesn't bring this problem of race up. And she talks about that a lot. She's like, this is a problem about sex. It's not about race, right? And she cannot kind of comprehend the idea that Black women exist as both, right? And you see this a lot. I mean, white suffragists are very critical that all of these sort of men, immigrant men, poor men, Chinese men in some cases, Black men, they can all vote. And what they always contrast that to is, but white women, and especially like these beautiful middle-class educated white women, can't vote. And so they just really kind of hide women of color and try to keep them out of that conversation in some ways. And then other times they're holding them up, like with the Chinese women. Right. It's really interesting question though.
I'm just super fascinated by those sort of internal dynamics where sometimes Alice Paul sounds like she's being strategic, but it just feels like she's just racist, right? I mean, just like that fundamental white women's rights, Michelle Newman sort of history that just feels like, yep, it's carried on multi-generationally. And this is almost a good excuse so that she doesn't have to face her own racism.
Right, she can say, I'm not that racist, right? I'm not as clearly these Southern white guys, these Southern, who, by the way, never buy this, right? No matter how much Alice Paul kind of tries to concede the point, they never support her, right? And everybody knows this, right? The Southern white women always, they write, white and Black suffragists write about this all the time. If Black women show up, they boycott, right? Their state delegations boycott and just refuse to participate. And they have a lot of power because of that. Again, the male politicians also are not supportive.
Yeah. So many good stories, so many kind of sort of really rich dynamics in this book. Okay, so I'm going to do the executive thing here and take a pause. Anybody that's on the Zoom call is very welcome to hang out for our class, genuinely. You can, hear lots of rich discussion about the progressive era and other things. You're also welcome to take off. I'm going to stop the recording, and Kathleen's going to stay with us, but I just, again, really want to kind of both say thank you and tell people to go out and buy Recasting the Vote. Also go out and buy Federal Fathers and Mothers, which is Kathleen's earlier book, just a fantastic book. We're going to talk a little bit about that, I hope, in a couple of minutes. But thank you, Kathleen. Really appreciate you sharing that with us in this more formal part of the conversation. Okay, so, and you're getting lots of claps from the gallery here. Okay, I'm gonna pause the recording.